Hi, this is part 2 of the series on the Genealogy of Morality by Friedrich Nietzsche. Last time we discussed the preface of the genealogy and the first essay. If you haven't seen that, you can find it on my channel and I will link it in the description. The first essay discusses the value judgments good and bad as humanly constructed and dependent on different cultures. Most importantly, Nietzsche looks at two different approaches to morality that to him make up the dominant forces fighting against each other over the course of European history. The Greco-Roman approach, founded on the principle of self-affirmation, the powerful saying that they're good just because they are powerful. And the Christian approach, inverting the state of affairs and postulating the weak and the poor as good instead. Master morality, the first one, sees bad as the absence of good, while good is just everything that they already are, powerful, strong, etc. Slave morality, however, introduces an active evil, which is what the masters are to them. And denying everything the masters do and are is what makes you good. Today, I will discuss the second and the third essay of the genealogy. The second essay is titled Guilt, Bad Conscience, and Related Matters. In this essay, Nietzsche presents his idea that society has done something we can all feel deeply to humankind. Inflict bad conscience. The way this argument is constructed is a little complicated, so let's go through it step by step. He says that humans have an innate enjoyment of cruelty. Not only do we like to see it, we much prefer to induce it on someone. So this goes for the whole video. Even if I don't agree with something, I will just present his argument here and you can form your own opinion, of course. And I do think that even if you don't agree with this postulation of human nature, his argument is still very interesting, independent from that. He says that in early societies, and even until recently, humans have connected festivities to cruel torture of criminal offenders. Like when something was celebrated, people like to also decapitate someone along the way to make the party more exciting and fun. But not only that, of course. You can also see this drive in the way that we sometimes publicly torture criminal offenders or murder them in painful ways or fight wars or do bloody rituals, etc. Especially interesting to him is the idea that we inflict physical pain on those who have committed a crime or broken a promise. For instance, torturing someone that didn't pay back their debt, even though this will not financially help the creditor in any way. We act as though somehow the physical pain experienced by the guilty amends for their debt. Underneath this lies a structure of debt and promise, from which he derives his idea of guilt. In German, Schuld, meaning guilt, and Schulden, meaning debt, lie very close to each other. The moral or ethical concept of guilt for Nietzsche actually derives out of an economic practice of credit and debt. He says that this stems from the fear of the upper class to lose their power, so they install institutions that uphold their rule and only punish those of lower classes. Because valuing a system of promise and guilt is making humans calculable. If you don't keep your promises, you will be tortured. Therefore, you must behave in the ways best calculable and most predictable. We cannot predict the future, yet we make promises all the time and say, I will do this and that, even though we cannot predict it. For Nietzsche, that is a fundamentally human characteristic that differentiates us from all other animals. But to be able to make such promises, we must live in calculable societies and according to customs and systems of morality that are not at all that good or logical to him. By saying this, he argues that this mode of punishment was constructed by the state system. With society implementing more and more ways to try and avoid torture and suffering, however, it suppresses the need of humans for such cruelty. That's crucial to Nietzsche. 1. We have an inherent want and drive towards inflicting suffering. 2. Society and religion has made us suppress this need and consider it sin, making us feel guilty. Guilt is the price humans have paid for entering society. So, what happens now? We cannot execute our enjoyment of cruelty towards others anymore. But the drive still exists. Therefore, we execute it on ourselves, hating ourselves, making us feel guilty for thinking sinful thoughts, internalizing a bad conscience. It is better to inflict suffering on someone, even if it is ourselves, than not to inflict it at all. Interestingly, this internal monologue many people have proves that very point to Nietzsche. Because we often think to ourselves, you are so worthless, why did you spend all day doing nothing, you are so ugly, you are so whatever, and so on. We say you, even if it is ourselves that we're talking to. For Nietzsche, that shows that it is the innate need for being cruel to others that comes to light here by using the second person. This is a psychological approach to explaining a societal phenomenon, which makes it very interesting as well. Also, you can of course see Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity here, as always. Christianity is very keen on limiting human instincts and desires by considering them sin. It is a common theme in Nietzsche's work to criticize this, and you can see here why. He argues that this makes us turn against ourselves and our very nature, and causes a lot of inner pain and suffering. He thinks that this is merely executing a morality of customs, a morality based on doing something because we have always done it that way, and not because it is actually good. Society commands and shapes human nature to change, but it doesn't command well, it just commands, and is therefore implemented as a custom to follow. Keep in mind here that Nietzsche's goal in this work and in general is not to change the way that the vast majority of people live, but rather to enable the greatness of the few. I don't think he would like to achieve that every human being rebels against these customs, but he does want to make it possible for the few to think beyond. He justifies or explains this by giving the example of the Buddha, who also turned against his own family in a rather cold way, but in the end became the advocator of compassion and love. But also, he does heavily criticize slave morality and many religious dogmas for being life-denying, and that I would say does apply to the masses. What does Nietzsche mean exactly by life-denying? What does he criticize in detail about the religious ideal? Let's talk about the third essay. In this third and last essay of the genealogy, Nietzsche introduces a third class of people. So, we had the masters and the slaves before. Now he introduces the priests. I will later expand on this idea to make it more relatable for us and present my own little comparison to a recent sociological phenomenon. So, the priests to Nietzsche are the class of the depressed, basically. He says that they are often outwardly similar to the slaves, sickly and depressed, but inwardly similar to the masters, because they are powerful and seen as such by the society as well. They are recognized as an important part of the system, as an intellectual elite. However, they do not execute their power politically or onto others like the masters, but instead practice the so-called ascetic ideal. If you ever got into Buddhism, Stoicism, Eckhart Tolle or Alan Watts or something, this is surely familiar to you. The idea behind it is that life is suffering and life is desiring things. I desire food when I'm hungry, or company, or social reputation, or money, and so on. However, this desire can only cause me suffering. It is an endless cycle of pain that I cannot break. I should just be present and happy without desires that could cause me disappointment. Therefore, the ascetic ideal is practicing the denial of these desires. Going without food for a long time, being chaste and abstinent, having no outward drive for money or reputation. To Nietzsche, this is actually also a form of slave morality. While slave morality denies the evil of the masters and tries to live differently, or already does and just describes it as good now, the ascetic ideal denies oneself. Everything that is human is rendered evil. An interesting criticism that Nietzsche has here is that while this self-denial and rejection of outward power and hierarchy is advocated, many religions actually have very hierarchical structures and require you to submit to your masters and elders. So what Nietzsche actually reads into this whole ideal is that it is just an attempt to deny life that fails. Because, as Nietzsche says, we would rather will nothingness than not will at all. The priests deny life for the sake of denying life, because their will to power still has to be executed, at least in some way. I'm going to take a quick moment to give just a little bit of background on the will to power, because I think it's relevant here, but this is of course just a very reduced summary of a huge concept. Over Nietzsche's work, there is not one stagnant concept of the will to power that could serve as a definition here, because Nietzsche changed and developed this principle over time. On the basis of it lies the Schopenhauerian idea of the will to life, which is a metaphysical concept that all life possesses, a striving for survival, a force driving us to eternal upholding of the will itself, of life itself. Crucially, however, this is connected to suffering for Schopenhauer, as life itself is suffering, so the will to uphold it is as well. Nietzsche, however, wants to twist this around, but also make it compatible with the evolutionary theory by Darwin that was first published after Schopenhauer had already finished his work, The World as Will and Representation. So Nietzsche starts by just establishing the will as an observation of species wanting to survive, aligned with Darwin. Later, however, it turns into a bigger, partly metaphysical concept. Maybe the word power is a bit off-putting to some or makes it harder to relate to this concept. It sounds like something abstract and vain and somehow cruel. So I want to give some examples of what this power actually is to Nietzsche. It is about affirming life, about finding yourself and living yourself, overcoming resistance and acquiring knowledge, about truly living and feeling and being, instead of trying to avoid suffering by denying all activities whatsoever. One of my favorite books, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, talks about this conflict in a very beautiful way. I deeply recommend it. Instead of meditating 5 hours a day to get rid of all of your emotions, not having a relationship, not eating enough, etc., just to have the illusion of control and not to be disappointed if something doesn't work out, this approach is way more a yes to life. Yes, I will go through this painful time and feel every minute of it, but I will also feel every minute of the joy of other times, and I will act and do things with myself. That is what affirming the will to power looks like. And as the example of the priest shows, denying it doesn't work either to Nietzsche. Basically he's saying like, well, the ascetics do have a goal, even if they say they don't, but their goal is stupid, and you should do something fun with your life instead. Back to the priests and the third essay. Nietzsche says that suffering is not really the worst thing we can experience. The worst thing is suffering without a meaning. He who has a why can bear with almost any how. So we desperately try to find a cause for our suffering. For instance, the master morality, the Greco-Roman one, blames the gods. The Roman gods or the Greek gods are fundamentally different from the God and Abrahamian religions. They are flawed and angry and sad and inflict pain on humans. But that doesn't answer the question of why it is me who is suffering. Why me? The priests answer this question with the concept of guilt. You are suffering because you are at fault. Nietzsche says that it is interesting that all world religions have this concept, either in the form of sin or in the form of karma, both blaming you for your own suffering. I mean, people even used to be blamed for being sick and disabled, as if that had something to do with their moral fault or something. All as an attempt to make sense of suffering and sense of this weird life that we're living. So, to keep my promise from the beginning and remain a predictable person, I now wanted to connect this topic of the priests to a wider class of people, namely the intellectuals. They take up a similar role in many societies nowadays, especially left-wing intellectuals who side with the oppressed. They have a lot of cultural and social capital, to describe it with Bourdieu terms, but still live relatively modest lives, or at least advocate them. This is of course hypocrisy to Nietzsche, and thinking about that reminded me instantly of current trends and developments in progressive bubbles. Cosplaying poverty, for example, as described in 2 very good video essays, one by Alice Capel and one by Yara Zaid. The intellectual and academic left priding itself in living a modest life and outwardly wearing working class or second-hand fashion. Of course, I have nothing against second-hand fashion at all. I just think a lot of people fail to realize the privilege that lies in relinquishment. While for other groups, second-hand clothing is associated with need, necessity, and a lot of shame, these modern priests wear them as proud symbols of their wokeness and judge those not wearing them as superficial. Very paradoxical, of course, as this is in itself a superficial act. Personally, I also hear a lot of students at university saying or complaining about being poor all the time. And while some of them surely definitely struggle with the economic situation and the rising rent prices, I still sometimes think that it's a bit ignorant and out of perspective to use the word poor here. Again, I'm not saying that secondhand clothes are bad or that Gen Z is not troubled by financial struggles, okay? I just found this parallel interesting and wanted to share these thoughts. Also, Nietzsche often appeals to some right-wing people, loving the idea of not siding with the oppressed and blaming the lower class for their own poverty. So why not end with the take that right-wingers could interpret as me saying that Gen Z is lazy and complains too much? Because that's definitely what I wanted to say. Well, and with that, the series... Well, can you even call it a series if it's just 2 parts? Anyway, the series about the genealogy of morality comes to an end. If you like this video, please consider liking, commenting, or subscribing, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Bye bye!